When you first open Studio, it may seem a little bit intimidating because there's so many different parameters here, but really it's very simple to use, very quick to use once you get used to it a little bit. So the first thing to note is that the entire UI is made up of different types of panels. So here you have the material editor panel, the materials list panel, the scene tree panel where all your objects, and here the cameras if you right click and create a new camera, and the attributes panel which changes depending on what you have selected. And these panels can be moved around and docked to different places of the UI simply by clicking and dragging on the title bar. And you can also dock them to different to an existing panel, and in that case it's going to put it in the tab like this. And you can resize the panel simply by clicking and dragging. Between the panels. And once you're happy with the layout, let's say you want to create a layout that's specific for arranging objects, so you may not need to have the material editor open, so you can just close it by pressing the X like so to have a little bit more space. And even the interactive preview or the resources browser, you don't need that. And once you're happy with your layout, you just go to Window, Save Layout, and you need to save it in the Maxwell install folder and in the layouts subfolder. And all the files that end with stlay are studio layout files. The ones you'll have other files there which end with lyt, and those are the layout files for Maxwell Render. So on some Windows systems, if you try to save a layout directly in a program files folder, then it's going to say that Studio doesn't have permissions for that. So just simply save it in another folder on your computer and then manually copy it to the layouts folder. Okay, and then you just need to restart Studio and you'll have your custom layout available here from the drop down, so you can quickly switch between different layouts. Two more handy things to know about Maxwell Studio. First is that it will open, when you reopen Studio, it will open with the exact same layout that you had when you closed it. So even if you have a specific layout here, but let's say you rescale this window, when you reopen Studio, it's going to open up exactly like this. And the second thing to know is that sometimes if Studio crashes, not always, but when it crashes, the preferences file for Studio may get corrupted, and then when you reopen Studio, you may see that things aren't working properly or some panels are missing and so on. So what you need to do then is to go into your Documents Maxwell folder, and you can see the path here for OS X. And on Windows, you have a ini file called Studio Prefs, and delete that file, restart Studio, and then things should get back to normal. And I think for OS X, it's going to be named plist. So delete that file, and again, things should be back to normal for Studio. To see which panels you have available to you, you can go to Window, and you can see here all the panels that are currently open or closed. So if I click the History panel, it's going to pop up in the last place it was visible in. And all the panels can only have one instance open at a time, except the viewport. So you can have several viewports at the same time. So when you click Window, New Viewport, and if you want to move this around, you'll notice that you can't really grab it at first. It's very difficult because it's just one small area. Let me do that again. So you can't really grab it sometimes, and in that case just expand it a little bit, and then you have a little bit of area here where you can click to position it, like so. Some panels may have a scroll bar, which may be difficult to see sometimes. You can see it here because it's almost the same color as the rest of the UI. And By the way, these sections can be expanded and collapsed, which is pretty practical, especially for the attributes panel, which may get very, very long. For the top toolbar here, you have a few options. If you right click somewhere in an empty area, you can turn on and off different buttons. For example, if you don't want to use file edit, because you also have them here, you can turn those off. And when you're happy with the button layout, you can also right click and choose lock toolbars to lock the toolbars in place. So that's a basic rundown of the UI. Next, I'll go through each of the panels and give you a few tips on each of them. Starting with the material editor panel, which is arguably the most important panel. So first here to the left, you have the material preview area. And if you double click here, you will see a preview of the material starting with the current selected preview scene. You can click the drop down here to change your preview scene. And actually, you can also create and add to this drop down your own preview scenes, which can be quite useful. And I'm going to show you how to do that in a later lesson. If you right click the preview, you have a few options. So the same options here to select the preview scene, load a scene, a next scene, preview scene, and previews. This can be quite useful if you want to compare different versions of your material. So let's say you have a material with a certain roughness like this, and then you can stop the preview, right click and choose store, and that's going to store a preview of this material and all its settings inside this list. And now, for example, if I change the roughness and do another preview, stop the preview, right click and choose store again. Now you can see that both versions are stored in this list, so I can quickly switch between them, and you can see that not only the preview changes but also all the settings here. You can see the roughness parameter changing as well. So this is a pretty nice functionality to quickly test different settings of a material. And if you want to get rid of a version, you can just click remove, and you can see now it's removed from the list. At the bottom of the right click menu, you also have a few options for the preview. So you can set the sampling level or the time limit, just as I mentioned before about the Maxwell Render parameters, for the material preview to stop. So it will stop when either 30 seconds are reached or the sampling level of 14 is reached. The scale and also the quality. So here you can choose between, let's say, two versions of the Maxwell Render engine. The production version is the main render engine, so to speak, and the draft version is the same as Maxwell Fire. You may have heard of it, the fast interactive render engine, which I'm going to talk about more in a future lesson. But the draft render engine can be quite good if you have materials that don't have transparency, and especially subsurface scattering materials. So if they're solid like this, so let's say metals, plastics, then the draft render engine can be quite a bit faster to use in the material editor compared to the production render engine. But again, if you are previewing a subsurface scattering material or one with transparency and refractions, then I think it's better to switch to the production render engine to have a better look of what the materials looks like, because the draft render engine is quite limited when previewing materials with caustics or transparency or subsurface scattering. The little lock icon here can be quite useful. It means that if you press it, you're going to lock the previews so that every change you make to the material, the preview is going to automatically update. So that can be quite useful in case you want to do lots of edits quickly and you don't want to always keep double clicking the little preview for it to update. And when you don't need it anymore, just press it again to unlock it and you're back to normal preview mode. Right beneath the material preview is the main layer area. So this is where the components of your materials live. And right at the top, you have a global properties row. And these are some switches and global properties that will apply to the entire material. And I'm going to go through those in detail in later material chapters. But for now, just keep in mind that the global properties apply to the material, the whole material, not just a layer. Beneath that, you start to see the components themselves. So material in Maxwell is made up of BSDFs, which is sort of like the base building block of a material. It's the component that lets you decide whether it's a opaque material, whether it's a transparent material, subsurface scattering, etc. So everything you do in Maxwell on a material, you do it mostly by these BSDFs or mixing different BSDFs together. So you can, for example, right click here and add a second BSDF or third one and so on. I think the limit is 99 per layer, so you're not going to reach that limit, hopefully. And also you can copy a layer, for example, and paste it. You can add a layer. So these are pretty self-explanatory of what they do. And you can think of these layers and BSDFs as layers in Photoshop. So the ones at the top will override or obscure what's underneath here, just as layers in Photoshop. In any case, I'm going to talk in more detail about layers and how to manipulate them in later lessons when dealing with materials. For now, just understand that this is the area where you can see the components that your material is made up of. And you can also, by the way, reorder things. So you can drag a layer. You can double click here to rename a layer, drag it on top, and so on. So you can reorder them as you want. And also one component which is a little bit special here, the displacement, it's always going to be added on top because you can't have more than one displacement component in a material. That's why it's always added on top. And you can see now, as soon as I added the displacement component, if I right click again, it's going to be grayed out, so you can't have a second one. And of course you can also name BSDFs, and that's a good idea to do, so you know what those do in the material. The rows here to the right lets you specify, or they also let you see and specify the amount or weight that a layer or a BSDF should have. So if I set it to just 50%, so this is in percent, then that layer is going to be 50% visible. To the right of that, you have a little on-off switch, so that's pretty practical. You don't have to delete stuff. You can just switch a layer off, and in that case it's going to also switch off any BSDFs inside the layer, or you can also switch off just specific BSDFs in that material. And to the right of that, it lets you know what blending mode a specific layer is in. So you can have two blending modes, either additive or normal, and you can either switch them from up here if you click on a layer to display this UI, or you can just switch them here by clicking in the row here. And also, if you decide to texture this opacity mask or opacity level, then you'll see here a T instead of that number. So it lets you know that in that case you're using also a texture to decide the weight of this layer, not just a percentage. That's hence the T for texture. Moving on to the right area of the UI, you can see here these are your main parameter settings depending on which component type you select in the left area. So these are the settings for the displacement component, these are the settings for the layer, these are the settings for the BSDF, and also if I click one of the BSDFs and choose add coding, this is yet another component for doing thin film interference stuff. And you can see it has its own settings. And finally, you can also click a layer or click anywhere, really a BSDF, and add an emitter. And that's going to add an emitter to that layer. And you can see that you can only have one emitter per layer. And by the way, Maxwell's ability to mix emitters and regular materials is a rather cool thing, and I'm going to show you that in the material lessons. You can do some pretty cool stuff mixing emitters and materials. So moving on to the UI here, some tips about that. So in a color chip, when you click it, you get the color picker, and here in the wheel you can choose the hue by clicking on the outside circle. On the triangle you can choose the opacity and the saturation and the value. And here you have different modes of choosing the colors, and like I mentioned before, I really prefer hue, saturation, value. And here, these color chips here, you can quickly press them to go back to that color, and you can also drag and drop a color chip here in case you want to create your own color palette for a specific project. And you can also drag the right one, so either the left one or the right one. And by the way, the right one shows you what the material was before you open the color picker, so that you have a way to compare the two, how much you changed them. That can be pretty practical. Finally, you have an eyedropper here, which you can press and you can choose any color from your screen, which can be pretty practical. And we can see here what I think that's the official next limit orange. So that's about it for the color picker. And click OK to set that color. Next, the texture picker. Here you can actually drag and drop a texture directly from an explorer to that color chip. Or if you press it, it opens up the texture picker, and again you can either browse here, or you can just drag and drop a texture either on the texture preview or the path here, whatever whatever makes you happy. And you can also switch on and off the texture, so then it's going to use the color again. And quite handy is the fact that you can drag and drop a texture to another texture chip, so that copies its settings and also the texture. So you can see here, this one has brightness 0, but if I drag this one, it's going to also copy the texture and any settings it has. And you can also drag it to another BSDF by just dragging it here on this area and then moving it again to that particular BSDF and dropping it wherever you wish. The spinners again can be changed either numerically, or if you press your mouse wheel and drag up and down, you can collapse different parts of the UI. So that's about it for the UI of the material editor panel. I'll mention briefly one pretty important thing. You may have noticed that the color picker and the texture picker are non-modal, meaning that you can't change anything else in the UI until you press OK here. So it may seem a little bit difficult or clumsy to always have to change a color, click there, click the preview, stop the preview, open up the color picker again or the texture picker, change the color and so on. So what you can do then instead is just simply press the lock icon, and then you can change these as much as you want interactively, so to speak, and you can see that it's going to change the material preview in that case, even without having to close the color picker or the texture picker. So that's a pretty practical tip to speed up your workflow. Just use the lock icon in that case. Moving on to the deceptively simple materials list panel. And actually it is simple. It only has one drop down here. We can choose either to show it as a list as it is now, or to show it as thumbnails. And in that case, you get a second drop down where you can choose the size of the thumbnails here. What is interesting is that you have a right-click menu with quite a few options, And one of the most useful ones are remove unused. So when you have a scene with lots of materials that aren't really used anywhere in the scene, if you click that, it's going to clean up your scene, and that could be quite useful to do right before you send your scene to render on a computer farm or other computers, for example, so that you don't transfer any materials and their textures without them actually being used in the scene. Another very useful thing to have, or option here, is select assigned objects. So that's going to select any objects that have this particular material applied to them, or assign triangles in case you have a material that's only assigned to a few triangles of an object. Reload preview, that can be quite useful. That means that it's simply going to reload the preview of all the selected materials that you have in the list. So if I select those, click reload preview, it's simply going to run the previews to the settings that you have set for the material preview. So, be a little bit careful there, because if you have a very long or very high settings for the sampling level or the time, it's going to, take quite a bit of time before it reloads the preview for that. So you can click cancel, and hopefully it's going to cancel the previews eventually. But I think actually you have to wait until it has finished at least the preview of the material that it was calculating when you pressed cancel. So don't shut down Studio thinking it froze. Just wait a little bit and hopefully it comes back to life. A few more things to mention about the material list, so it wasn't that simple after all. You can see here you have two switches when you go to list mode, S and M. So the S stands for shadow, and that when you turn it on, it's going to turn on the shadow option in the global properties of the material. I'm going to explain that in the material lesson. And the same for the M here for the matte. It's going to turn on and off the matte for that material. So that's a quick way to do that. And also you see from the list which ones have it turned on or off. And finally, the one nice tool here, which is assigned by name, can be quite useful sometime if you want to apply a certain material to a list of objects or a specific group that has have a specific naming convention. So for example here, if I wanted to apply the red material to, let's say, only the cubes that have a name with an underscore in it, I can just write first a wild card. So that's the star, and then write cube, and then just underscore, and press OK, and that's going to apply the material only to cube underscore something. So that can be quite useful sometime.